Good morning and welcome to the Spaces virtual conference on the theme of Net Zero Carbon Climate Emergency 2021. My name is Andrew Rowe and I'm your chair for this webinar. Before commencing my introduction of our speakers this morning, I'd like to thank our 5 sponsors: Atkins, Faithful+Gould, IES, MPS Group and Wilmot Dixon for their support. Without them, we would not have been able to put this conference together. All the webinars over the next 2-week period, and this is the second week, are all being recorded and loaded onto the Spaces YouTube channel. Delegates and Spaces members will be sent a link at the end of the conference. Recordings are only available for delegates and members. If you have any questions, please include them in the chat box during the speakers' session, and we'll try to answer those questions at the end of the event. This morning's webinar is Net Zero Carbon, What Does It Cost? It will be presented by Annabel Clark, Steve Jackson and Peter Dunn. Annabel is an Associate Director at Faithful+Gould. She's a qualified BREEAM Assessor, and Annabel has been supporting clients with their net zero carbon policies. And she's accomplished in leading design teams to enhance value, reduce cost and risk in supporting sustainable reputations. Steve is a Regional Director of Faithful+Gould and heads up the residential sector in the London and the South East. Steve specialises in sustainable developments, working with clients to achieve their net zero carbon rating. And finally, Peter is Associate Director and Chartered Quantity Surveyor with extensive experience of all pre and post stages of project delivery. Peter has been the driving force behind Faithful+Gould's Sustainable Cost Guide, which you will hear more about in this session. The session will focus on the costs associated with achieving net zero carbon on a project, and it will use some examples of 3 local authority projects. Annabel, Steve and Peter, welcome and thank you for supporting the Spaces 2021 conference. And over to you.
Brilliant, thank you, Andrew. So net zero carbon, what does it cost? It's the question that we're currently being asked on every single one of our projects by every single one of our clients. So before we start, Faithful+Gould deliver project and programme management consultancy services across the world. Our teams work in project management, building surveying, cost management, strategic asset management and sustainability. Andrew's kindly given us each an introduction, but I thought I'd just go into a little bit more detail about what we each do. So, hello, I'm Annabel Clark. I'm an Associate Director. I sit in our London office, and I currently work supporting projects with delivering holistic sustainability. And that's increasingly focused on net zero carbon. But my aim is to make everyone see that net zero carbon is one part of the sustainability picture, and we need to look at it in conjunction with all of the other elements of the social, the economic and the environmental outcomes. And my aim is to lead design teams in delivering sustainable solutions. Steve Jackson, a Regional Director from the LSE region, who heads up our residential sector, will be speaking to us today on the cost of new build schemes and what the cost uplift is for net zero carbon. Steve is currently working with local governments and private residential clients who are focusing on net zero carbon. And with buildings contributing to approximately 40% of the carbon emissions in the UK, it's absolutely crucial that the building sector drives the focus on net zero carbon and is able to lead the journey to decarbonisation for the UK, but also act as a leader for our global world so that people have a template of how to decarbonise buildings, cities, countries, and ultimately the world that we live in. Peter Dunn is an Associate Director who also sits in our London office, and he'll be talking to us today on the cost of retrofit in our buildings. With announcements and speculation that, with the retrofit market, each home might have to, it might cost up to £10,000 to retrofit each home. This is a huge area that we need to focus on. We also have a lot of non-domestic buildings that need to be decarbonised. With at least 80% of the buildings that exist today, they will still be around in 2050. So this absolutely has to be a key focus area. So with our new build area, we're looking to make sure that we don't add to the problem of carbon and ultimately climate change. We want to make sure that we're delivering only net zero carbon solutions from now so that we prepare for the future. And with our retrofit, that will mean that we understand the scale of the problem and therefore the pace and the cost of how we retrofit and deliver on the UK's legislation of net zero carbon by 2050. So what I'd like to speak to you about first this morning is just setting the scene, looking at the challenges that we currently face in the buildings market, looking at some of our buildings projects specifically. I'll then pass over to Steve, who'll talk about a specific new build project that he's been working on and share some real life costs and examples from that project. And then to Peter, who can talk through a retrofit example and how Faithful+Gould are supporting central government, local government and our private sector clients with decarbonising their buildings and their estate portfolios. So we know that reaching net zero will bring the UK important benefits, but it will incur really large costs. And estimating either of these with any accuracy is hugely difficult, given the level of uncertainty around new and emerging technologies and the changes in the economy and people's behaviour. As I've said, our buildings and cities are absolutely fundamental to our global economy and crucially, their central role in addressing climate change. Here in the UK, buildings contribute to 40% of carbon emissions. But the cost of achieving those are highly uncertain. The Climate Change Committee estimated in 2019 that the annual costs of achieving net zero could increase over time to around 1 to 2% of GDP in 2050. That's approximately $50 billion each year. So the transition to a net zero economy will require a concerted effort and action by all sections of society. It requires the right policies and government funding to support businesses to achieve this new target, whilst also maintaining a balance with all the other pressures that are being faced across industry. We have seen a lot of movement recently with the public sector decarbonisation scheme, allowing funding, but this needs to go even further. We need more money promised so that we can deliver on our net zero carbon commitments. But where are we now? What is it that is causing us challenges on our projects? Well, innovation and availability is a huge challenge for our projects. We don't understand the technology that's coming through in the future. 2050 is a long way off, but we need to catalyse on new processes, mechanisms and technologies to achieve net zero buildings, using new financing mechanisms and also alternative building materials. The more that we use something, the cheaper that it gets as it comes commercially available on the market. In terms of where we're looking, not all solutions are fully available now. So should the questions that our clients are asking us are, should we go first or should we wait for those solutions? And what is the cost implication of that? And that's where we will hopefully talk you through some real life examples here today. For stakeholder engagement, it's key that we secure commitment and communicate our vision meaningfully. It's really important to us that it isn't just a small group of net zero carbon technical experts that deliver on this. It will require everyone to deliver on this message. And therefore, we need to integrate net zero carbon into all of our decision making, not just put it onto one separate consultant. And that's why it's crucial today. So Peter and Stephen both here are in our cost management service, and Faithful+Gould are making a real effort to integrate net zero carbon and the implications of that into all of our cost management, project management services. We need to make sure that stakeholders are bought into the ultimate outcome of net zero carbon. With the data, this is a real challenge too. So to even understand the cost, the scale and the pace that we need to decarbonise at, we need to have the right data. So ultimately, decarbonisation comes down in a building to correct asset management. We need to have the right data to be able to design correctly and to be able to understand the challenge. For risk, there is a risk involved with net zero carbon at the moment that is being played out in the market at the moment. There is no direct set pathway to net zero carbon. We're all learning together. There is There is additional risk involved, as you know, a lot of this isn't being done on a large scale yet, but very shortly it will be. And so we need to make sure that we're taking the right amount of risk with innovative technology, but making sure that that isn't at the detriment of the economic sustainability of a project. Then we also need to make sure that we're quantifying benefits. So we have the cost side, we have the benefit side, and we need to make sure in here that we are looking at the added benefits that these projects can bring. For instance, looking at how this energy efficiency can contribute to reducing fuel poverty. But finally, and obviously the focus of this webinar, is the cost of net zero carbon. It is the question that everyone is asking, and with huge figures being spoken about, such as that $50 million a year, or between 1 trillion to 2 trillion a year, even in a new report, which warns that the cost of unmitigated climate change will be much higher. This is where our focus will need to be. But the cost of inaction would be far greater because of the need to adapt to substantial climate change, such as building flood defences, dealing with health impacts of higher temperatures, and also making sure that we make the most of those benefits, improvements to human health and enhanced biodiversity that will allow the human population and the world around us to flourish. So net zero carbon has many definitions, and this is one of the challenges that we are currently facing. In this diagram here, this shows whole life carbon split up into operational energy and embodied carbon. Total operational energy is made up of regulated components, including your heating, cooling, hot water, fans, pumps, and lighting, and your unregulated ones, such as IT equipment, lab equipment, catering facilities, the laptop that you've probably got plugged in today. Then you have embodied carbon, which is made up of your other elements, so transportation, products, the construction process, maintenance and replacement, and end-of-life disposal. In today's webinar, we want to be really clear that we are focusing on the cost of operational energy at this stage. This is because it's easier to quantify for the projects that we're looking at, and we are looking into better quantification and costs of embodied carbon. Within Stephen's presentation, he will talk about Passive House. Now, Passive House is a certification that can be used on buildings. However, in this context, we're talking about passive house principles, providing a high level of occupant comfort while using very little energy for heating and cooling. They're built with meticulous attention to detail and rigorous design and construction according to principles developed by the Passive House Institute. And there are 5 key principles that Steve will go through in his presentation. At Faithful+Gould, as a company, we understand that we have a responsibility towards our clients and employees and societies in everything that we do, and everything that we touch has a direct impact on the world. Reaching net zero carbon emissions by 2050 is not going to be cheap, but it's a cost that we are all going to have to bear, and we need to ensure that the most cost-effective solutions are being utilised. I'll pass over to Steve now, who will talk us through the cost of achieving net zero carbon in new builds.
Thanks, Annabel, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. As Annabel touched on, I'm going to talk and focus on the costs associated with new builds of achieving net zero carbon. And I'm going to concentrate, despite the introduction, on one specific example rather than 3, although we have a number of other projects that I'll touch on at the end of my section to talk about the other projects we're working on as well. But I'm going to focus on one just to show some more detail behind the numbers that are influenced. So Annabel touched on the challenges. What are the challenges in terms of new build and the costs that we see? So the first of those is a lack of current expertise in supply chain, which is driving up costs. There's limited experience in the UK contracting market, and more importantly, in the subcontractor supply chain. And in our experience on the projects we've been looking at, in some cases, there is just a single supplier available with the correct accreditation for certain items. That in itself drives up cost. I'll touch on that a bit later on, where I think the future is going on that. The second point is there's a balance between design and planning. A sustainable building looks significantly different to a normal building, and there's a need to balance urban design against sustainability criteria. That's a key point that has come across in our experience of the buildings we've looked at that look to define net zero carbon. And the final point of challenges here is there's an insufficient incentive. Across most of the London boroughs and local authorities we've worked with, there's currently a £90 a tonne carbon offset payment. That's simply not sufficient incentive for private developers to look at carbon. I'll touch on that in the case study I'm going to show you in a moment to show the sorts of costs we've had to spend to offset a minimal amount of carbon offsetting payment. That's making already constrained appraisals hit by COVID and Brexit and inflation, shortage of supply, is applying other cost pressures that are meaning that carbon offset is simply easier to pay that than it is to try and implement some of these schemes. However, local authorities, I think, have a unique position to play in driving this forward, and I'll again touch on that in a second when I go through my case study. So I'm going to focus on a case study, as I said. This is with a London borough. It's a residential scheme for about 130 units. The client we're working for have a more aggressive strategy than Annabel referred to earlier about 2050. Their strategy is to be net zero by 2030. Now, again, when we say net zero, they have defined that as the unregulated energy in the operational side of their business, not embodied carbon, which we all think the industry is too early in its infancy at the moment to look at embodied carbon at this stage. So we assessed 3 options on the scheme. The first was a baseline option, which complied with building regulations. The second was an aspirational, which was to go as far as we could towards achieving net zero without significantly impacting the appraisal. And the third was to adopt passive house principles, as Annabel touched on earlier, and to see what that did to the numbers. Going all the way to the far extent, adopting the passive house principles enabled us to achieve an 89% reduction in CO2 emissions. So not fully net zero, but it meant that our carbon offset reduced from 70-80% down to 11%. A significant reduction in our offset payment. We achieved that by the use of a number of items, which I'll come on to in a second, and with the use of air source heat pumps and twin plate HIUs on the MEP side of the building. There was another option, which was to then supplement those air source heat pumps with water source heat pumps. However, I'll come on to the costs in a second. That had a significant further uplift in costs for a minimal extra reduction in CO2. Because the technology was limited, and at this stage that proved to be even too far for a local authority to take on board. We maximised the PV on the roof. We have on this building, the roof is literally littered with PV. We have 350 PV panels across those buildings. You can see there is no roof space left, so we physically cannot fit any more PV on the site. So we have, in the passive house principles, totally maxed out what we can achieve, and that's how we've got to the 89%. So what did that cost? Well, you'll see here on the slide, there was a 2.45 million uplift of capital cost from the baseline to the passive house principles, which was approximately a 6.4% uplift. I always try and temper percentage uplifts because it depends what your starting point was. Our starting point on this scheme was 35% over building regs. That's what our baseline scheme was achieving. Therefore, our uplift is probably potentially lower than you may have seen on other schemes where typically there's a range between 6 and 9% uplift. So we were at the bottom end of the scale, but our starting position was probably slightly better than most. The carbon offset payment, as I've said there, reduced by 135,000. So it doesn't take a mathematician to work out that 2.45 million to achieve a saving of 135,000 is not good financial viability sense. This is the biggest barrier, I think, to the adoption of net zero carbon across the private sector. However, as I say, I'll touch on the uniqueness for local authorities later. All of that, however, did result in a 30% reduction in heating costs per year for the tenants and residents. This is particularly important for our client because the building is going to be retained as an asset and used. So why did our client look at adopting passive house principles? Well, as a local authority, their strategy, as I said, was to be net zero by 2030, much more aggressive. They're going to build an asset now, which we're designing. As you can see, this is in the early design stages. This will be built by 2025, 2026. So in 4 years after completion, if they didn't adopt passive house principles, they'd have a building in their estate which was owned as an asset that then didn't meet their criteria of being net zero carbon. So they'd have to go and retrofit. So we'd have a whole load of costs in the future that we could avoid by adopting these principles now. So our client wanted us to look at what those meant to avoid that exercise in the future. So what are the main cost drivers? So insulation is probably the first one. So we've had to increase the insulation to walls, ground floor and roof, thickness all the way around. The impacts of doing that are felt in other elements. So the insulation increase to the walls, for example, increases the GEA of the building to maintain the internal areas. So basically the building gets slightly larger. If you imagine an elastic band just being slightly loosened to let the building get slightly bigger. That, however, impacts the frame, it impacts the roof, it impacts all of the floors. So there's more area of building that's needed in order to achieve the internal areas. That increases the cost. The facade complexity increases. So whilst we have a simplified expression in our facades for a passive house building, for example, we had inset balconies on our baseline building, which we then reverted to projecting balconies because they're much easier with thermal breaks to achieve the U values required. That simplified the facade. However, there are additional costs in terms of wider cavities because of the insulation increase, the air tightness increase requirements that then put the complexity of the facade back up and resulted in a net increase in our facade costs. We had to use triple glazing in our windows. In order to achieve our passive house principles, we targeted a U value of 0.8 on our windows. That significantly reduced our supplier base, even for triple glazing. Typical triple glazing is 1 to 1.1 U value. We had to go, there are 2 or 3 suppliers in the UK at present that were capable of achieving 0.8 with their systems. So again, that drove up costs because we've got a limited supply chain. The MEPH systems had to improve their efficiencies. So we use an MVHR manufacturer that is passive house accredited. Again, in the UK currently, there is only a single supplier, and that came at a premium of £1,000 per unit, which is a significant extra cost to carry across 130 residential units. We also had to change the layout of the risers for the MEPH services. Typically in a residential building, we'd have had a single riser and then distributed along the corridors to each apartment. In order to avoid overheating of the corridors in a passive house building that's super insulated and super airtight, you have to avoid those corridor pipeworks. So in the end, we ended up with a hotel-style riser strategy that has a riser within each apartment. That increases the distribution costs on the MEPH. And then finally, there's additional preliminaries costs. So all of this work takes longer to build. That increases the program, which we've assessed at approximately 10% longer for this building. There's increased supervision with an air tightness champion being required, increased services commissioning being required and balancing, and increased allowances and frequency of air permeability tests. So the air permeability tests on a traditional project you might do once or twice at the end. We're doing it several times throughout the project to make sure the air tightness is being achieved as we go along. All of that is increasing the preliminaries costs. The other cost I haven't mentioned here, but is worth mentioning as well, is there was also an increase in the fees client side for monitoring the quality during the build. That has resulted in a circa 20% uplift in the overall professional fee levels to deliver the project. So there's an additional cost that needs to be factored in as well. And whilst I mentioned this building was a residential building, we've also been involved in a number of education buildings, leisure buildings and office projects in new build across Faithful+Gould. They're experiencing similar levels of uplift of between 6 and 9% total capital cost. So what's the future? I touched on this earlier. So the increased uptake will reduce costs over time. Local authorities can play a key part in that. As local authorities have self-delivery models and can operate at far lower margin expectations than the private sector, which is backed by funders, this in turn enables local authorities to drive the net zero agenda forwards. A greater uptake ultimately leads to lower costs as more people get into the market, experience enters the marketplace. I like to use the analogy here that I heard someone talking about the other day of the electric car principle. If you think of and I can't resist this as a QS, I'm sorry, I'm going to apologise in advance, of an S-curve. So if you can imagine the electric car is currently on the, and passive house is similar, is on the upward slope of the bottom of the S-curve, where more people are taking it up, but the costs of taking it up are currently prohibitive. So not enough people are jumping on board. As more and more people jump on board, and this is where I think local authorities can take the key driver, as more and more of these schemes get delivered to passive house standards and to net zero standards, more of this technology will become available. Suddenly the one MVHR supplier I talked about will become 4 or 5, The contractors will learn how to do this. The experience will be there. It won't need as much supervision because people will be experienced in achieving airtight buildings. Years ago when I first started, buildings achieved 10 meter cube per hour airtightness. Now 3 is commonplace, and it's not even frowned upon. This is where we're moving. This is the direction we're moving. So all of those things will take us from that bottom start of the curve to suddenly loads of people start doing this. And when loads of people start doing it, the costs suddenly start to plummet very quickly. And when loads of people do it and it starts to cost similar to a traditional building, everyone jumps on the bandwagon. Then you get the huge escalation, the vertical part of the S-curve. And then when everyone's done it, you then get to the top of the S-curve where everyone's building net zero carbon. It becomes the norm and you flatten back off again. That's where I see the future. Ultimately, there's a report that's been sponsored by Atkins, by the Passive House Trust, which comes to a very similar conclusion that over time, as more and more uptake comes in, these costs will reduce to a point where they will be negligible, if not the same as current building costs. The elemental focus, the analysis to focus the design. So net zero carbon buildings need not cost extra. At present, they do because there's a limited supply chain. But as more experience comes in and as we start to focus our spend, as I mentioned earlier, we'll focus on spending on the right parts of the buildings. That in turn will mean that we can keep the overall costs within acceptable viability constraints, whilst at the same time focusing on spending the money in the right places. This is going to be a balance, as I mentioned earlier, between great urban design and sustainability, and is going to require planners to come on board. So with the case study I showed you, the local authority, we're working alongside their planners as well as their development team to get everybody on board with what this building needs to look like to achieve a net zero result. And the final point on here is that, particularly again with local authorities who tend to hold the assets rather than private sector who sell them on, there's a much greater focus on the whole life costs of these buildings. What do they cost to operate and maintain and run? That in turn means that an additional capital cost up front can be recouped over the life of the building, and the whole life assessment of those costs is absolutely impeccable for the success of net zero carbon. I think at that point I will hand over to Pete, who's going to talk to you about the similar exercise in retrofitting.
Very good to be here. So yes, I'd like to talk predominantly around the retrofitting of buildings. With a vast part of our buildings in the UK being existing stock, there's a big focus on retrofit of those buildings to really sort of help move our net zero journey forward. So where I wanted to start is going back to this LETI net zero carbon definition. So when we think about retrofit, we're really thinking about operational carbon. So the UK Green Building Council defined operational energy as when the building amount of carbon emissions associated with the building's operational energy on an annual basis is 0 or negative. A net zero building is highly efficient and powered from an on-site and off-site renewable energy source, with any remaining carbon balance being offset. So we're really looking at the operational aspects and the operational carbon. So we also think about, when we're dealing with net zero, there's also a number of co-benefits that can happen, and I think that's important to sort of just touch on some of those at the moment, because they do impact more than just achieving net zero. So we have healthier and more comfortable buildings for our staff, and with the civil service on a whole looking to become a brilliant civil service, retain excellent people, attract more people. These are really important co-benefits. There's evidence that improves productivity, quality control in construction as well, less fuel poverty, impacts on the overall grid. So there's a number of co-benefits that we feel that are important to sort of consider, as well as the net zero benefits on the operational carbon. So moving into the sort of the next one, what we're seeing typically is actually, because buildings are already in existence, it's actually slightly narrower what types of interventions you can actually do to achieve net zero reductions in the operational carbon. So what we're seeing a lot of are the same themes coming through. So what we've tried to do here is just highlight out what we're seeing as our top net zero interventions. And I think this is a really important to sort of highlight, because it helps sort of slightly demystify what net zero is and what we're actually having to do to achieve it in existing buildings. So we've got three main categories. We've got energy efficiency, which is where we're looking at technology and energy management to really sort of help reduce the load on the energy in a building. We're looking at heat, so moving away from fossil fuels. We're looking at power, and that's renewable power, predominantly photovoltaics. And then that's going to move us to net zero. And as we heard from the Green Building Council, there will always be an element of offsetting. So what are the typical interventions in those three categories? So typically we're seeing, and Steve's touched on some of these earlier, we're looking at insulation of walls, we're looking at insulation of roofs, we're looking at LED lighting, we're looking at fabric insulation, including windows. We're looking at better smart metering, BMS, better building information to really understand your operational usage. There's also heat. We're looking at changes of the heat gas boilers to air source heat pumps is typically where we're seeing a lot of interventions moving. And then we're looking at power, so renewables, and typically we're looking at on-site, and on-site being, as Steve mentioned, on the roofs, or they might be on the ground if the building has that sort of space. If a building doesn't have that space, we're then looking at off-site, so investing in or paying contributions to an off-site photovoltaic renewable space. So that's typically the interventions we're seeing. And actually, when you start thinking about that, you start thinking, well, actually, we can actually start modelling a building and a whole estate based on those interventions, which actually starts moving up the roadmaps that central and local government authorities are being asked to produce for their sort of estates. So when we start considering those interventions, we can actually start building some costs associated with those interventions, which is where we're seeing a lot of questions and a lot of support needed at the moment. So what are the challenges therefore? And picking up again on some of the themes that Annabel and Steve said, what are the main cost drivers, and what are the challenges that are causing sort of our clients at the moment to sort of really start their roadmaps or really get an understanding of their estate? So the first thing is, and Steve touched on it a bit earlier, is around the technology. So there's the analogy of, do you back the CD or the mini disc player? Technologies, particularly in power and heating, are evolving. We've all heard about hydrogen. They're not there yet. So you're sort of looking at what technologies you want to invest in, and also how do you build flexibility for those future technologies. So that's definitely a challenge at the moment. Unfortunately, a lot of the buildings and estates, there's just a lack of accurate information. It might be because the states are evolving. It might be a lack of information coming from FM vendors. It might be because we haven't moved into sort of the B2IM BIM sort of stages of an estate. So it's actually quite hard to understand the existing state of a building and an estate. As we know, and as it's been touched on, there's significant costs with additional investment. However, on this particular point, there are also a lot of programs that are such as life cycle replacement programs that are looking at periodic maintenance and replacement of central plant. So it's not always the case that the net zero investment has to be on top of that. Quite often it's changing the life cycle replacement work to more net zero technology, and therefore you're not doubling up a cost. defining a client's estate. Often estates are varied significantly, from offices to unique functions for that client, or the estate's changing in terms of scale. So you're getting new buildings coming in, or you're getting sort of the buildings being offset. So we've obviously got the levelling up agenda, which is changing locations as well. So there's a significant dynamic happening to clients' estates at the moment. There's obviously, when we're actually in the delivery stage of these interventions, there's quite a significant impact on day-to-day disruption of staff and occupiers in the buildings. So in that scenario, it's very much really building up good risk approaches, understanding how the technologies are going to impact the operations of the building. And then, as we said, the skill gap. There is a skill gap, and there's a shortage of technology. So that as more and more of these requirements come on board, the more and more that skill gap is going to become evidence. However, we are all in this, and we are all developing, and we are all becoming more net zero focused. And as we do that, we're going to retrain, and we're going to grow that capability, and we're going to get the experience. So it will all move forward. It's just at this moment in time, it is a key issue. So what does the future look like? Well, so we're sort of looking a lot with the sort of left of zero construction playbook sort of terminology with sort of clients, and what we're sort of seeing is where do you start, and how do you start? And key thing is to start. But we're looking at what is the leadership want? What is the ambition? Is it to be reputationally at the forefront of the net zero interventions and decarbonising an estate? And if so, then that generally drives the behaviours to have a shorter than 2050 sort of program. But there's obviously people also waiting for the technology. And there's also assets just being invested in it, such as plant boilers that you don't want to replace straight away, because there's quite a lot of embodied carbon to do that. So there's those sort of challenges on the time frame. So really, it's about starting to try and build a roadmap over the existing state. So what we often do is look at a state from a desktop exercise, and we build costs against a number of assumptions on interventions on the building types of an estate. Once that's done, it sort of creates an initial position. Then we're looking at, well, from that position, how do we challenge that? How do we refine those assumptions? And quite often, that initial piece of work will identify trends. So one particular client who's got a large estate, we identified actually 10 buildings of their estate actually produce 60% of their carbon. So actually, quite quickly, you can look at a narrower sort of field of buildings to help the net zero journey. Then you can start refining it. So you start looking at more information, you carry out surveys, you understand more about the existing technology in those buildings, and then that will really help build your robustness in that sort of initial model that you can then take through the business case process, requesting for additional financial support on your net zero journey. And then there's a number of models to deliver that, and it comes down to your estate and what the FM providers, how they're set up, what contractual setup have they got, how complex some of these interventions are. Do you batch works together? Do you buy some of these technologies together to get benefits? So there's a number of those sort of scenarios that you need to consider to really sort of optimize the investment. So that sort of takes you through the sort of roadmap and the journey to get to sort of delivering net zero interventions. I think one of the key things also is around benefit realization. You've always got to keep an eye on what the benefit realization and how you're going to assess that from the investment. A lot of approval for financing at the moment is based on then demonstrating the benefit of these interventions in buildings. So you really need to be able to demonstrate that benefit and have that process understood right at the beginning. So what's it all cost? Well, we are very, very close to releasing a high level range of costs for these interventions on typical types of buildings such as offices, residential, and in the educational sector at the moment. That will hopefully be released in the next few weeks, and that will have quite a lot of good information around the ranges for these interventions. The challenge is obviously every building's different, every estate's different, and there's always going to be age aspect, building location factors which will always impact these costs. But hopefully when we release that, you'll see the sort of typical ranges which will really help sort of demystify the costs. Best way to see that is we'll be releasing it through LinkedIn, I think, in the next couple of weeks. So that's the best place to look for it, I would say, at the moment. And I think, Annabel, brings me to a conclusion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter. And Andrew, I think over to you for the questions.
That's great. Annabel, Steve and Peter, thank you for your fascinating presentations this morning. We've got a lot of questions that are coming in the chat box. So please do continue to ask the questions and we'll try and cover as many of those as possible over the next sort of 15 minutes. I've got first question here, probably one for you, Steve, which was from Greg, which said, if you had not built to passive house standards, for the example that you'd given, what would have been the cost to retrofit later on? Presumably more.
Yeah, I saw that come in on the chat. I was monitoring the chat as we went through. So great question, Greg. And I think it's not just a cost exercise here. I think the key here is that to retrofit at a later date has compromises. So you're going to have existing tenants in these flats, which are then going to be disturbed. You may potentially get people move out, so you may lose income. There are other things other than just the pure cost. The other point to make as well is that if you have to retrofit the building, depending on how you do that retrofitting, Pete's touched on this in his presentation, but if we overclad the walls on the outside, you start to get fatter buildings, deeper reveals on your windows. It starts to impact how the building functions. So yes, definitely would have cost a lot more, but I think the cost is not just the capital cost in doing the works later, it's also the cost and the impact of doing those works and the disruption that it causes. I hope that answers your question, Greg. Yeah,
that's good. Thank you, Steve. And I suppose just to follow on from that, again, another question from another Greg was that did you get a passive house certificate, and would there have been further measures that you'd have had to have required to get a passive house certificate for your particular example, Steve?
No is the answer to the question, and yes to the second question. So we would have to have a passive house certifier, which is an additional professional fee. We don't have that on this particular scheme because we're only adopting passive house principles. So we're not looking to get this certified as a passive house scheme. But if we did, then we would have to have a certifier, which is an additional fee and additional cost to monitor during the construction process.
That's great, thanks. Maybe one other question then, perhaps for one of the other team. Luke's asked a question about, is an EPC of A+ actually a net zero building? And do you know what percentage cost over and above real building regulations does it take to achieve A+? Really good question.
Yeah, incredible question. We probably don't have exactly the right people on this call to answer, as I guess it would be better directed at kind of your MEP team. But I mean, EPC is obviously a report that assesses your energy efficiency of a property and recommends specific ways in which your energy efficiency could be improved. So I appreciate that while we have spoken about operational energy on this call, I think in depending on where your definition sits, your EPC rating only looks at your operational energy. So if you're trying to look at net zero carbon from a whole life carbon point of view, it certainly is not the same, and it's not being used for that reason. I think the other thing that's worth noting is that EPCs are valid for 10 years. And so, you know, a lot of EPCs in the UK might be out of date, they need to be checked. So I think while they're really interesting and a great way of us kind of assessing our building stock and understanding where our challenges are. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done on top of just the EPC ratings.
So just perhaps one of the tools in the toolkit, isn't it?
Exactly that.
That brings me nicely on to a question from Richard. And I know, Richard, this is one of your things that you are very passionate about, as are a number of people on the call today, is about kind of energy efficiency goes beyond just sort of energy metering, and the kind of whole energy and environmental monitoring in use, and the sort of kind of performance in use kind of is a kind of really key to making sure that we don't get sort of into pitfalls of poor design and particularly poor commissioning. So I think it's probably just a statement, but probably one that we all kind of have got some good examples of buildings that didn't get commissioned very well or didn't perform to how they might have done as we expected.
Yeah, and Andrew, I could just add to that, Richard, that on the case study scheme that we're working on, part of the additional fees we've got is to do a post-occupancy evaluation. So it is part of the process for our scheme to look at not just what we've done, but how it is then used as the building is operated.
Great, thank you. And just a reminder as well, we've got Dr. Roderick Dunn, who will be presenting actually this afternoon at 4 o'clock. And Rod is, again, a passionate speaker about kind of performance in use. And I think that probably will be a really good kind of link to that particular webinar.
Yeah, if I can just add to that too, sorry, just on that performance and use, think that's absolutely crucial. And Steve touched on the post-occupancy evaluation. I think soft landings and government soft landings are the key principle that, you know, design teams and we're looking to pull through on all our projects so that that performance gap is minimised, so that the buildings are performing in use. And I think actually it almost links back to that first question of what would have happened if you didn't install the passive house principles and came back to retrofit later. And I think it's kind of maybe a common pitfall of net zero carbon that we automatically think of kind of the snazzy technology like the PV panels and the wind turbines, but actually there's so much that can be done before, the energy efficiency measures, that fabric first approach that's absolutely crucial and is really hard to retrofit later. So, you know, your super insulated envelopes, your airtight construction, high performance glazing, that's where our focus should be. And actually, if you're, obviously we hope that people go for a full net zero carbon building, but we're also realistic. You know, there's a lot of talk in the industry about net zero carbon ready buildings, but actually it's the fabric first approach that's key. And then if, you know, looking at maybe roof strengthening for adding additional PV when that money is available later, or looking at battery storage in the future. So looking at that future adaptability in that way, but really focusing on the fabric first approach and energy efficiency.
Yeah, that's great, Annabel. Thank you. Another comment by Simon, I suppose a question as well. Excellent presentation. And I think Simon points out that there's probably a real desire in the industry to build net zero carbon, but rarely does the budget and programme align. And I think one of the points that he's making here is that, you know, how do we get funders to realise this? And I suppose, Steve, you mentioned about kind of perhaps what some of the local government interventions could be, but how do we get sort of other funders to kind of make the kind of connection?
As I sort of touched on in my presentation section, I think it will be a natural progression. Because the local authorities are in a unique position. Most local authorities we work with, their appraisals, certainly the case study I looked at, all they were looking to do was break even because their driver is to provide housing. It's not to make money on that housing. Some local authorities I know do look to make some money on the housing they do to fund other services within the council, so we're acutely aware of that as well. But the primary driver on these schemes is for them to break even. That gives them a lot more flexibility to incorporate some of these technologies than private developers do, who have got a fund who want their share of the profit. So everyone's taking a slice of the pie. It leaves you much more constrained with what you can do. However, as I touched on with the S-curve principle, if the local authorities start to drive this, which is where I see the real leverage is coming from local authorities, if that gets driven, the technology comes down in cost, it becomes more commonplace. The private developers will have to follow suit, because simply they'll then be competing in a marketplace, particularly on residential. They'll be competing in a marketplace where you can buy a home that's got energy running costs of £100 a year, or another one that's got energy running costs of 3 times that. Which home would you buy? Yeah, simple.
Yeah.
I would also like to add, there's also a lot of grants around at the moment, which can help incentivize this investment. You do a lot of work to support those funds, and what we'd advise is you need to be reasonably ready. You need to really understand what the funding's going to achieve and what buildings are going to spend it on. To do that, you need to start building the case. If we don't start, then you'll never get close to being able to secure additional funding that's going to help offset some of this cost. So for me, it is really important to think about, well, I need to get myself ready. I need to think about where I can actually sort of secure some extra grants, and then we can actually start learning and increasing or decreasing our carbon footprint.
Good, great, thank you. Another question coming here from Philip, and he asks, the UN's latest annual emissions gap report in 2020 led PricewaterhouseCoopers describing the current decade as pivotal. Thus, given there's only 8.5 years left of it, how does this impact on what we've clearly set out, especially in terms of what's already existing, please?
Yeah, I mean, it's a brilliant point. We've thrown in a few figures through our presentation around the fact that 80% of the buildings that exist now will exist in 2050, but exactly the same, if not way more, stand for 2030 and the commitments that a lot of our clients, local government, central government, declared climate emergencies. It is a huge challenge. I think the scale, the pace, the cost, everything that has to be considered can't be underestimated. There is only 8.5 years left. Hopefully that now feels very close to most people. A typical building project might take you, 2 to 4 years. It's not like these things are done really fast. There's a huge amount that has to be done. I think the commitments that people are making now with kind of science-based targets at organisational levels are filtering through into project-specific targets. And I think that hopefully we will see, exactly as has been described there, a pivotal change in how people are talking about net zero carbon. And actually coming back to that funding point of view, then the drivers of a project will move from that triangle analogy of programme, cost and quality to hopefully a square of programme, cost, quality, carbon and sustainability.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Annabel. And we've also finally got a question about the RICS building carbon database. And I know you didn't cover this, and I don't know whether you know and you can cover the question, but Declan's asked, can you explain a little on the RICS building carbon database? What is it? And how can RICS members actively promote this to clients who are under budget constraints? I don't know if there's one that you can cover.
In terms of what it is, I can cover that. So RICS officially launched the Whole Life Building Carbon Database back in 2019, and it was commissioned by the Waste and Resources Action Programme, commonly known as WRAP, and also endorsed by the UK Green Building Council, and it captures embodied carbon data for whole buildings. The purpose of it was to reinforce the RICS professional statement that we all undertake, which was captured in their document, the Whole Life Carbon Assessment for the Built Environment, which all RICS members must act in accordance with. In terms of how that could be used by clients, I guess the database can be used by kind of RICS members and is there for exactly that purpose. I guess RICS, the UK Green Building Council, WRAP, there's loads of different databases out there. So there's kind of commercial embodied carbon databases. I probably shouldn't name too many, but there's quite a few out there that can be used. Lots of those are endorsed by the UK Green Building Council. They can be used to help inform projects. And I think increasingly it's just looking at making sure, the RICS is a great database to use because we know that it's being accurately verified. I think that will be kind of the movement in making sure that the performance gap that we're seeing in operational energy and in buildings that we kind of understand it's what's that performance gap for embodied carbon now. You know, when you do an embodied carbon assessment, you make assumptions about where your product materials are coming from. Are they being flown in? Are they traveling by boat? Are they coming by lorry? You know, and then actually, is that what happens? There will be a huge performance gap there in embodied carbon and what those carbon emissions mean. So using databases that organisations such as the RICS are making available will help promote this for the future.
And I think just to add to that, Annabel, yeah, whole life awareness. Obviously, there's always been a push-pull between capital costs and assessing whole life costs, and you know, lots of clients have a capital budget for a particular year. Spending more money now to save money in the future is a difficult discussion to have, but it's a discussion we have got to have. We've been with some of our clients helping them to write the business cases to say there's the justification for spending more money now to save money in the future. I think that's the key message, Declan, probably that comes out from the RICS Building Carbon Database and how we can use it, is to get some more awareness and education into our clients of assessing buildings costs over its life cycle of 60, 70 years, not just the 5 years we build it.
Great, thank you. And I suppose that links me nicely to another webinar that we've got, another tool and carbon calculator. But tomorrow at 9 o'clock, Dr. Jack Williams is giving a presentation on the FCBS carbon calculator for schools. And that does include things like embodied carbon. So that's another kind of tool in the toolkit that perhaps members and clients can use. So I think probably we're very close to our sort of hour. So thank you very much, Annabel, Steve and Peter. I really do thank you for your presentations this morning, but also thank you for being put on the spot and answering some of our questions, which you've done extremely well. So I'd like to end today's seminar by really taking the opportunity to also thank our sponsors. Again, Atkins, Faithful+Gould, IES, the MPS Group and Wilmot Dixon. Without their support, we wouldn't have been able to put on these sessions over the last couple of weeks. And if I could also now just ask all delegates just to vote on a scale of 1 to 5 when the poll comes up in the chat box, how you've felt today's presentations been. So if you can just do a quick poll for us and vote, that would be good. And just a reminder really that there still is a few days left this week for seminars. We've promoted a couple this morning, but please book onto them. There are still some spaces. We still can fit you in if you want to attend. And again, all of them are being recorded over the 2-week period. So please go to our YouTube channel to pick them up once they're uploaded. So thank you very much, and we'll close the session this morning. And again, thank you to our speakers, very, very informative.
Thank you.